A black woman, poised and powerful, stepped onto the plane, her tailored suit and quiet confidence commanding the space around her. She had faced her share of challenges in life more than she cared to recount, but today, all she wanted was a peaceful flight home after a grueling week. Yet, the moment she sat in her first-class seat, the air shifted. The crew's eyes lingered too long. Their smiles stretched thin. It began with a flight attendant questioning her ticket not once, but twice, while the other passengers settled in without a second glance. The doubt in their voices wasn't subtle, but neither was her resolve. She met their scrutiny head-on, refusing to shrink under the weight of their unspoken assumptions. What started as quiet tension soon escalated. Another crew member insisted there had been a mistake with her seat assignment. "It's protocol," they said, their tone laced with condescension. But the woman, unyielding, fired back. "Then check everyone else's ticket. Not just mine." The surrounding passengers began to murmur. The injustice too blatant to ignore. A silver-haired woman a few rows back spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "She's right. Why aren't you checking anyone else?" The crew pushed harder, their frustration visible, but so was her quiet power. She refused to be moved, refused to let their biases dictate her worth. The captain was called, but even his authority faltered under the weight of her unwavering presence and the growing support from other passengers. By the time the plane landed, the crew had retreated, their actions laid bare for all to see. But the woman had done more than hold her ground. She had turned the moment into a reckoning. Social media lit up with videos, passengers recounting her bravery and the crew's behavior. What started as an attempt to diminish her ended with a powerful reminder. Strength in the face of injustice doesn't just change the moment, it leaves a mark that others can't ignore. The crew had challenged her, but it was her dignity and courage that made them regret it. The airport was a symphony of chaos, trolleys screeching against polished floors, muffled announcements echoing from unseen speakers, and the constant murmur of travelers navigating their private battles against time. Elena Brooks stepped into this familiar cacophony with the kind of measured grace that turned heads without invitation. She wasn't rushing. At 56, she had earned the right to move at her own pace. A slow, deliberate rhythm that defied the urgency thrumming in the veins of those around her. Her black suit, tailored sharp as a scalpel, clung to her like armor, shielding her from glances she had long since stopped acknowledging. It wasn't just clothing, it was a declaration. The heels of her shoes struck the marble floor with a staccato rhythm, each step a reminder to the world that she belonged wherever she stood. But belonging was a tenuous thing in America. Elena felt it first at the gate. A young agent, her smile tight enough to wrinkle the corners of her eyes, hesitated for the briefest moment when Elena handed over her boarding pass. The pause was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but Elena caught it. She always did. It wasn't hostility, it never was. It was something quieter, more insidious, the unspoken question lingering beneath polite professionalism. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Brooks," the agent said, her tone betraying a flicker of disbelief. Elena didn't respond. She knew how this scene played out. As she walked onto the jet bridge, the air seemed heavier, colder. It always felt that way, as if the narrow corridor carried the weight of unspoken judgments. First class was sparsely filled, a sanctuary of leather seats and hushed tones. Elena stowed her bag with practiced efficiency, sinking into the window seat and exhaling deeply. For a moment, the tension eased, but it was only a moment. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was soft, almost sweet, but it carried the authority of someone who had spent years practicing firmness beneath a veneer of politeness. Elena looked up to see the flight attendant, Claire Anderson, standing before her, clipboard in hand. Claire's expression was neutral, but her eyes betrayed her sharp, assessing, searching for something. "I'll need to see your ticket," Claire said, her tone light but firm. Elena's jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm. She reached into her blazer and handed over the slip of paper without a word. Claire examined it, her gaze lingering far longer than necessary, as if trying to decipher a foreign language. After an eternity, Claire handed it back. "Just making sure," she said with a clipped smile. "Sometimes there's confusion." "I wasn't confused," Elena replied evenly, her voice low but firm. Claire blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Before retreating down the aisle, Elena returned her gaze to the window. But the air around her felt different now, charged, expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next move. 7 minutes later, the next move came. "Miss Brooks." Claire was back, her tone louder this time, her smile more strained. "It seems there's been an issue with your seat assignment. I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to move to the main cabin." The words hung in the air like a slap. Elena turned slowly to face her, her voice a low simmer. "No." Passengers stirred around her, their eyes darting toward the confrontation like moths drawn to flame. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, but none spoke. Claire leaned in, lowering her voice. "Look, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. But sometimes people end up in places they don't belong." There it was, the thing Claire hadn't said but had been building toward all along. Elena's gaze sharpened. "And where exactly do you think I belong?" Claire flinched, barely enough for anyone else to notice. But Elena saw it. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms with deliberate ease. The air around them thickened as the tension began to coil, tightening with each passing second. A voice broke the silence, a woman's. Older, steady. "She's right." The silver-haired passenger 2 rows back leaned forward, her expression calm but her tone cutting through the cabin like a knife. "You've checked no one else's ticket but hers. Why is that?" Claire stiffened, her professionalism cracking ever so slightly. "It's just protocol." "Ma'am, protocol?" the woman echoed, her voice rising. "I've been flying first class for decades, and I've never seen protocol like this." The murmurs grew louder. Passengers shifted, their discomfort palpable. Claire's face flushed as she straightened, her grip tightening on the clipboard. Elena didn't move. She didn't need to. "I paid for this seat," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "And I intend to stay in it." The moment stretched, the silence electric. Claire hesitated, her composure unraveling as the weight of the cabin's collective gaze bore down on her. Finally, she turned on her heel and disappeared down the aisle. Elena exhaled slowly, her hands resting on the armrests like a queen reclaiming her throne. She knew this wasn't over, not yet. It never was. But for now, she had won. The storm would come again. But she was ready. She always was. The hum of the engines was a steady backdrop, a mechanical white noise that usually lulled Elena into a kind of uneasy calm. But not today. Today, that hum felt like the sound of something held too tightly, something waiting to snap. Elena watched the clouds drift past the window, trying to steady her breathing. She had faced moments like this before, too many times to count. In the boardroom, at exclusive restaurants, even in the lobbies of hotels where she was a paying guest. The faces changed, the settings varied, but the script rarely did. It was always the same story, her presence questioned, her belonging challenged. She let her gaze wander to the aisle, where passengers were now openly watching her. They weren't looking at Claire, who had disappeared into the galley, they were looking at her. Always at her. Their stares weren't accusatory, most of them looked away quickly when her eyes met theirs, but they carried the weight of discomfort. The silent question of what she had done to invite this confrontation. She let them wonder. The footsteps came before the words. Claire was back, her stride more rigid this time, her face set in a mask of forced politeness. Behind her, another flight attendant trailed hesitantly, a younger woman with wide eyes and nervous hands that fidgeted with her name tag. "Miss Brooks," Claire began, her voice louder now, calculated to reach not just Elena but the entire cabin. "The captain has reviewed the seating chart, and it appears there was indeed an error. For safety reasons, we must ask you to relocate." Elena tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Safety reasons," she echoed, her tone calm but sharp enough to cut through Claire's carefully constructed facade. "And what might those be?" Claire hesitated. The younger attendant shifted uncomfortably beside her, her eyes darting toward the passengers now leaning into the drama. "It's standard procedure," Claire replied finally, her tone clipped. "Standard for whom?" Elena asked, her voice rising just enough to be heard by those nearby. "Because I don't see you questioning anyone else's seat." The murmur started low, spreading through the cabin like ripples in water. Passengers whispered behind raised hands, their gazes flickering between Elena and Claire. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed irritated, as though the confrontation itself was the inconvenience. The older woman with silver hair, who had spoken up earlier, leaned forward again. "She's right," the woman said, her voice cutting through the whispers. You haven't checked a single other ticket in this cabin. Why is that? Claire's face flushed. The carefully rehearsed professionalism she had clung to was slipping, her frustration now visible in the tightness around her mouth. Ma'am, she said, turning to the silver-haired woman. This isn't your concern. It is. The woman shot back, her tone firm. It's all of our concern. The tension in the cabin was no longer a quiet undercurrent, it was a storm-gathering force. The younger flight attendant, Jessica, her name tag now visible, stepped forward, her voice soft and unsure. Maybe we should just let her stay, Jessica said, glancing nervously at Claire. I mean, it's not like, Jessica, Claire snapped, cutting her off, but it was too late. The words had been spoken, and the air between them crackled with the weight of what wasn't being said. Claire's authority was slipping, and everyone could see it. Elena uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees as she looked up at Claire. You've made your point, she said quietly. You've questioned me, you've embarrassed me, and now you're doubling down because you don't know how to back out gracefully. Claire's eyes narrowed, her professionalism now completely abandoned. Miss Brooks, if you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to escalate this further. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Then escalate, Elena said, her voice steady. She leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. Call the captain, call security, hell, call the police, but I'm not moving. The murmur in the cabin grew louder, passengers now openly commenting on the scene. A man across the aisle muttered something about overreacting, while a younger woman further back pulled out her phone, her camera angled toward the confrontation. Claire's face turned a deep shade of red. She spun on her heel and marched back down the aisle, leaving Jessica standing awkwardly in her wake. The silver-haired woman leaned closer to Elena. You're doing the right thing, she said softly. I know, Elena replied, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The minutes that followed were excruciating. Elena could hear Claire's voice from the galley, sharp and clipped, though the words were muffled by the partition. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, the weight of their judgments pressing against her like an invisible force. When Claire returned, she wasn't alone. Captain Monroe, a tall man with graying hair and a stiff, no-nonsense demeanor, followed closely behind. His presence shifted the air, the quiet murmurs in the cabin falling silent as he stopped beside Elena's row. Miss Brooks, he began, his voice calm but authoritative. I'd like to resolve this situation as quickly and peacefully as possible. Then I suggest you speak to your flight attendant, Elena replied, her tone unyielding. Monroe's eyes flickered toward Claire, who stood just behind him, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. It seems there was some confusion regarding your seat assignment, he said. There's no confusion, Elena said firmly. This is my seat. I paid for it, and I'm staying in it. The captain hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around the cabin, noting the passengers now openly watching the exchange. The silver-haired woman caught his eye and raised an eyebrow, daring him to say more. Monroe exhaled slowly. Very well, he said finally. We'll continue with the flight as planned. Claire's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She opened her mouth as if to protest but thought better of it. As Monroe turned to leave, Elena caught his gaze. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. He nodded but didn't meet her eyes. Claire stormed back to the galley, her footsteps heavy with frustration. Jessica lingered for a moment, offering Elena an apologetic smile before following after her. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm, the tension lingering like a storm that had passed but left the air charged. Elena leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply. The battle wasn't over. It never was. But for now, she had won. The air in the cabin was deceptively still, but Elena could feel the cracks forming beneath its polished surface. The hum of the engines was a relentless backdrop, a steady reminder of how high above the ground they were, how far from any place where she could simply walk away. She glanced out the window, the clouds below stretching endlessly. The sky was indifferent, expansive, but here, within the confines of this cabin, everything felt too close, too sharp. Jessica, the younger flight attendant, passed by again. Her movements were hesitant, almost apologetic, as she offered snacks and drinks to the passengers. When she reached Elena's row, she hesitated before speaking. Miss Brooks, she said softly, her eyes darting toward the galley. "Would you like some water?" Elena met Jessica's gaze, seeing the flicker of discomfort there. The unspoken apology. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. Jessica nodded quickly and poured the glass, her hands trembling just slightly. She placed it on Elena's tray table and moved on, her presence fleeting but not unnoticed. From the galley, the sound of Claire's voice rose, sharp and clipped, though the words were indistinct. The tone was unmistakable, frustration mixed with indignation. Elena didn't need to hear the specifics to know what was being said. She had lived through too many conversations like this, where her resistance was reframed as hostility, her refusal to comply cast as a disruption. She sipped her water, her hands steady now, but the quiet didn't last. "Ladies and gentlemen," Claire's voice crackled over the intercom, thinly veiled professionalism masking her irritation. "We appreciate your cooperation as we work to ensure a smooth and safe flight for all passengers. Please remember to keep the aisles clear and follow crew instructions at all times." "Thank you." It was a message for everyone, but Elena knew who it was really meant for. She smiled faintly, a humorless curve of her lips. This was the next step in the dance, public shaming disguised as professionalism. It was a tactic she had seen before, a way to isolate and diminish without ever naming the target. The man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward Elena before quickly returning to his tablet. The silver-haired woman behind her leaned forward again, her voice low but steady. "They won't let this go," the woman murmured. "I know," Elena replied. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, the quiet hum of discomfort spreading like smoke. Passengers whispered to one another, their voices just loud enough to carry fragments of the conversation. "What's happening? She's refusing to move. Why don't they just leave her alone?" And then Claire reappeared, her stride purposeful, her clipboard once again clutched like a shield. This time, she wasn't alone. Jessica trailed behind her, her expression wary, and with them was another crew member, a tall man in his 40s. His uniform immaculate but his face tight with the kind of practiced neutrality that betrayed his unease. "Miss Brooks," Claire began, her voice firm but brittle, "I'm afraid this matter has now escalated. If you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to involve security upon landing." The words were a sledgehammer, blunt and heavy. Elena set her glass down carefully, her movements deliberate. She turned to face Claire, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "Security?" she repeated, her tone measured. "Yes," Claire said, her voice rising slightly. "We cannot allow this situation to disrupt the safety and comfort of other passengers." The silver-haired woman behind Elena spoke again, louder this time. "The only disruption here is you," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. Claire's eyes snapped to the woman, but she didn't respond. Instead, she focused her attention back on Elena, as if determined to reclaim control. Elena leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "If you think calling security will resolve this, then by all means, do so," she said. Her voice was steady, but the challenge in her tone was unmistakable. "But understand this. I'm not moving. And I'm not apologizing for sitting in the seat I paid for." Jessica shifted beside Claire, her discomfort evident. "Maybe we should." "Jessica," Claire interrupted, her tone sharp. The passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Heads turned, whispers grew louder. The cabin had become a theater, and Elena was the unwilling star of the performance. The tension reached a boiling point when Captain Monroe reappeared, his presence heavy with authority. He stepped beside Claire, his gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Elena. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we've reviewed the situation, and I must insist that you comply with the crew's instructions." Elena met his gaze unflinchingly. "And what instructions are those, Captain? To move to a seat I didn't book? To justify my presence here when no one else has been asked to?" Monroe hesitated, the weight of her words pressing against him. He glanced at Claire, who stood stiffly beside him, her jaw tight. "This is about ensuring the safety and order of the flight," Monroe said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "No, Captain," Elena replied, her voice rising just enough to fill the cabin. "This is about something else entirely. And I think you know it." The silver-haired woman behind her spoke once more, her voice steady and unwavering. "She's right," she said. "I've been sitting here the entire time. And I've seen how this has unfolded. This isn't about safety or order, it's about singling her out. The murmurs of agreement spread. Passengers emboldened by the woman's words. Monroe's expression tightened, his authority now visibly fraying under the weight of the cabin's collective gaze. Elena watched him carefully, noting the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wouldn't push further. Not now. Not with the tide turning against him. Very well, he said finally. His voice clipped. We'll address this matter upon landing. He turned and walked away, Claire trailing behind him, her shoulders rigid with frustration. Elena exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing but not disappearing entirely. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their stares a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and quiet solidarity. The battle wasn't over, but for now, she had held her ground. And that, she decided, was enough. For now. The cabin was quiet now. But it was a deceptive quiet, the kind that crackled with tension just below the surface. Elena Brooks sat in her seat, her posture upright, her hands resting on her lap. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared calm. But every muscle in her body was taut, coiled like a spring. The plane sliced through the sky, thousands of feet above a world where this moment would likely be forgotten by everyone except her. But up here, in this confined space, the battle was not over. She could feel it in the way Claire had stormed off, the way Captain Monroe had hesitated just long enough to reveal his uncertainty. She could feel it in the stares of the passengers. Some were curious, others irritated, but just a few were something else entirely, watchful. Perhaps even quietly supportive. The silver-haired woman behind her spoke again, her voice low but deliberate. "You've handled this well," she said, leaning forward just enough for Elena to hear. Elena turned slightly, offering a faint smile. "I've had practice." The woman nodded, her gaze steady. "That's the part that should bother us all," she said softly. Before Elena could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle. This time, it wasn't Claire. Jessica, the younger flight attendant, approached cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her like a child sent to deliver a message she didn't understand. "Miss Brooks," Jessica began, her voice hesitant, "the captain has asked me to inform you that law enforcement will be waiting at the gate when we land." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Elena's pulse quickened, but her face remained composed. She had expected this, though hearing it aloud still hit her like a blow. "And what exactly are they supposed to do?" Elena asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Jessica shifted her weight, glancing nervously toward the galley. "I don't know, ma'am. I'm just relaying the message." Elena nodded slowly, her gaze piercing. "Tell the captain I look forward to meeting them." Jessica hesitated for a moment longer before retreating, her steps quick and uneven. The murmurs in the cabin began again, louder this time, the passengers now openly discussing the unfolding drama. Some whispered in hushed tones, their words indistinct, but others were less careful. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered from across the aisle. "They're really calling the cops over a seat?" another voice said. Incredulous. Elena didn't react. She let the words wash over her. Neither comforted nor disturbed, she was focused now, her mind already preparing for what was to come. The silver-haired woman leaned forward again, her voice louder this time. "Do you need someone to speak up for you when we land?" Elena turned to her, surprised by the directness of the offer. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but I think I can handle it." The woman nodded but didn't lean back. "Just know you're not alone," she said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. For a moment, Elena felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected, gratitude. But the moment was short-lived. From the front of the cabin, Claire reappeared, her expression grim, her clipboard nowhere in sight. She walked with purpose, her gaze locked on Elena, as though determined to make one final stand. "Miss Brooks," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "The captain has authorized me to remind you that failure to comply with crew instructions is a federal offense." The words were a sledgehammer, meant to intimidate, to silence. But Elena didn't flinch. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward slightly, meeting Claire's gaze head-on. "And what instructions would those be?" Elena asked, her voice steady. "To give up my seat? To accept being singled out when no one else in this cabin has been questioned?" Claire's face reddened, but she didn't look away. "This is not about race," she snapped. her professionalism cracking under the strain. Elena smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "You're right," she said. "It's not about race. It's about power. It's about who gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't. And right now, you're using yours to tell me I don't." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers now openly watching the exchange. The man across the aisle lowered his tablet. His expression a mix of discomfort and something else, guilt. Perhaps. Or recognition. Claire opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, a voice from the back of the cabin cut through the tension. "She's right." Everyone turned. A younger man, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, stood near the bulkhead. He looked nervous but determined, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. "I've been sitting here the whole time," he said, "and I haven't seen you check a single other ticket. Just hers. So yeah, it's about power. And maybe you should think about why you're using yours like this." Claire's face turned a deep shade of red. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her authority crumbling under the weight of the cabin's collective gaze. Elena turned to the man, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. She didn't know him, but his words had shifted the balance in a way she hadn't expected. Claire straightened, her hands clenched at her sides. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the galley, her retreat marked by the whispers and stares of the passengers she had tried and failed to silence. Elena exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing but not disappearing entirely. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But the tide had turned. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope. The tension in the cabin had taken on a life of its own. An oppressive weight pressing down on every passenger. Even the hum of the engines felt subdued, swallowed by the quiet murmurs and uneasy shifting of bodies and seats. Elena Brooks sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap. On the surface, she looked calm, composed. Inside, her thoughts churned like a storm at sea. She glanced out the window, the clouds below glowing faintly in the sunlight. It was strange, she thought, how something so vast could seem so distant. How the quiet inside this cabin felt louder than the roar of the engines. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Brooks." She turned to see Jessica, the younger flight attendant, standing beside her row. Jessica looked nervous, her hands clutching a tray as though it might anchor her. "The captain wanted me to check if you need anything," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" Jessica hesitated, her gaze flickering to the galley, where Claire was no doubt waiting. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice cracking slightly. I don't think this is right." Elena studied her for a moment, noting the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted toward the other passengers as if seeking reassurance. "What isn't right?" Jessica swallowed hard. "The way they're treating you." The admission was quiet, almost inaudible, but it hung in the air like a beacon. Elena nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. Jessica lingered for a moment longer before retreating, her movements quick and unsure. Elena turned her attention back to the cabin. The passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Their gazes darted toward her and then away, their whispers growing louder. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their discomfort. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about them. From the front of the cabin, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Monroe's voice filled the space. Calm but firm. "We will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your belongings secured. We appreciate your cooperation as we prepare for arrival." The announcement was routine, but it carried an undercurrent of warning. Elena knew what awaited her at the gate. Security. Authority. Another battle she hadn't asked for but had been forced into. She glanced at the silver-haired woman behind her. The woman met her gaze and gave a small, firm nod, a silent gesture of solidarity. The plane began its descent, the cabin tilting slightly as the engines roared. Elena gripped the armrests, steadying herself. Around her, the murmurs grew quieter, replaced by the shuffling of bags and the click of seatbelts. As the ground came into view, the weight in Elena's chest grew heavier. It wasn't fear she had faced worse than this, but the exhaustion of knowing what was to come. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the cabin lurching forward. The sound of the engine's shifting gears filled the space, followed by the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off. Elena stayed seated, watching as passengers around her began to stand, pulling bags from the overhead compartments. Their movements hurried and awkward. Claire appeared again, her posture stiff, her face carefully neutral. "Miss Brooks," she said, her voice clipped, "please remain seated. Security will meet you at the gate." Elena met her gaze steadily. "I wouldn't dream of leaving." Claire's expression faltered for a moment before she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The silver-haired woman leaned forward again, her voice low. "Do you want me to stay?" Elena considered the offer, the weight of it. "No," she said finally. "But thank you." The woman nodded, her expression resolute. "You're not alone," she said softly. The plane came to a stop, and the doors opened. Passengers began filing out, their steps quick, their gazes avoiding the scene unfolding around them. Some lingered, hesitating near the exit, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Elena stayed in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The silver-haired woman passed by, offering a small smile before disappearing down the aisle. And then they came. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the cabin, their presence heavy and deliberate. They moved with purpose, their expressions neutral but their eyes sharp. "Miss Brooks?" one of them said, his voice calm but firm. Elena stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She smoothed the front of her suit, adjusted the strap of her bag, and met their gaze. "That's me." The officer nodded. "If you'll come with us. Please." Elena glanced around the cabin one last time, taking in the faces of the passengers. Some looked away, their discomfort visible. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. She walked past Claire, who stood near the galley, her face tight with satisfaction. Elena didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her. She didn't need to. As she stepped into the aisle, the younger man who had spoken up earlier caught her eye. He gave her a small nod, his expression serious. Elena nodded back. The officers escorted her off the plane, their steps measured, their presence a wall between her and the curious stares of the passengers. As she walked through the jet bridge, the tension in her chest eased slightly. This wasn't over, she knew that. But she also knew something else. Something that steadied her steps and straightened her spine. She wasn't just walking for herself. She was walking for every person who had ever been questioned, doubted, diminished. And she wasn't done yet. The terminal was cold, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the polished floors and rows of rigid plastic chairs. The hum of announcements echoed through the air, each flight number and gate change sounding distant and irrelevant. But for Elena Brooks, this space felt heavier than the confines of the airplane she had just left. She sat in a small waiting area just beyond the jet bridge, flanked by the 2 officers who had escorted her off the flight. Their presence was stiff, more performative than necessary, a silent declaration that someone needed to be controlled. The officer on her left cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice measured, "we're just here to gather some information about the incident on the flight." Elena turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. His face was calm, almost kind, but there was something behind his eyes, a discomfort, an unease that betrayed his attempt at neutrality. "What incident?" Elena asked, her tone sharp but even. The question lingered, the weight of it forcing the officer to hesitate. He glanced at his partner, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There was a report from the flight crew," the officer continued, "about a passenger refusing to comply with instructions. We're just trying to get a clear picture of what happened." Elena leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And what exactly did they report?" The officer hesitated again, his composure faltering under her steady gaze. "That you refused to move to another seat when requested by the crew." Elena allowed a moment of silence to stretch between them before she spoke. "Did they also report that I was the only passenger asked to prove I belonged in the seat I paid for? Or that no one else in first class was questioned?" Her words landed heavily, the unspoken accusation cutting through the sterile air. The second officer finally spoke, his voice lower and softer. "Miss Brooks, we're not here to pass judgment. We're just trying to do your job." Elena finished for him, her voice carrying a quiet edge. "I understand." But she didn't let them off the hook. She turned her attention back to the first officer. "Tell me something," she said, her tone deceptively calm. "If a white man had been sitting in my seat, would we be having this conversation right now?" The officer stiffened, his expression faltering. "I can't speculate on." "You don't have to." Elena interrupted. Because we both know the answer. The second officer shifted again. His discomfort palpable. Miss Brooks. He began cautiously. No one's saying this is about. Elena's laugh was quiet but sharp. Cutting him off. No one ever does, she said. That's the beauty of it. Isn't it? It's never about race until it is. And by then, it's too late to name it. The officers exchanged a glance. Their silence speaking louder than any defense they could muster. The door to the waiting area opened, and Captain Monroe stepped inside. His uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He approached the small cluster of chairs with the deliberate authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. Miss Brooks, he said, his tone polite but firm. I wanted to speak with you personally before we proceed. Elena raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. I've reviewed the crew's account of what happened, Monroe said, his hands clasped behind his back. And while I understand your frustration, I must emphasize the importance of maintaining order during a flight. Order, Elena repeated, her voice laced with quiet disdain. And you think I disrupted that? Monroe hesitated, his composure cracking just slightly. The crew felt unsafe? Elena finished for him. Threatened? Is that what they said? Monroe's jaw tightened. They felt you were non-compliant. Elena leaned forward, her voice rising with each word. Non-compliant because I refused to give up my seat? Because I dared to question why I was being singled out? Tell me, Captain, how much compliance would have been enough for your crew? The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Monroe looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the fluorescent lights. I'm sorry you feel this way, he said finally, his voice quiet but strained. Elena's laugh was bitter, her frustration bubbling to the surface. You're sorry I feel this way? She said. That's not an apology, Captain. That's a dismissal. The second officer, sensing the tension, stood up. Captain, he said, his tone cautious. Maybe we should take a moment. No, Elena said, standing abruptly. We don't need a moment. We need accountability. Her voice carried through the small room, sharp and unwavering. The officers exchanged another glance, unsure of how to proceed. Monroe looked at her, his expression a mix of frustration and resignation. This isn't how I wanted this to go, he said quietly. Elena took a step closer, her gaze piercing. And how did you want it to go, Captain? Did you expect me to sit quietly? To accept being humiliated? To let your crew's biases go unchallenged? Is that the order you were trying to maintain? Monroe opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his shoulders sagging slightly. The door opened once more, and Claire appeared. Her face flushed, her expression tight. She stopped short when she saw the scene unfolding, her eyes flickering between Elena and Monroe. I'll say this one more time, Elena said, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. This was never about a seat. It was about power, and the way you chose to wield it. The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Finally, Monroe spoke, his voice low. You're right, he said. This shouldn't have happened. The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it carried weight. Elena didn't respond. She simply picked up her bag, her movements deliberate and measured. Without another word, she walked past the officers, past Claire, past Monroe, and out of the room. The terminal stretched before her, bright and cold and indifferent. But as she stepped into its vast expanse, she felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. This battle was over. But the fight was far from finished. Elena Brooks walked through the terminal with the deliberate pace of someone who refused to rush. Even when the world around her moved at a breakneck speed, the polished floors reflected the glaring lights above, and the air buzzed with the restless energy of travelers. Each step she took felt like a declaration. I am still here. I am still standing. But beneath her calm exterior, she could feel the storm brewing. The confrontation wasn't over. Not really. The residue of it clung to her skin like the stale air from the cabin. The officers had let her walk away, but their presence, their scrutiny, lingered like a shadow. The captain's reluctant admission echoed in her mind, hollow and unsatisfying, and Claire, her face flushed with anger. Her authority dented, had been silent in that final moment, but her silence had spoken volumes. Elena approached the baggage claim area, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that seemed louder than it should have been. Around her, travelers moved with purpose, their focus fixed on their next destination. No one paid her any mind. but she felt their absence of attention just as keenly as she had felt their stares on the plane. She spotted her black leather suitcase gliding along the carousel and stepped forward to retrieve it. As she pulled it from the belt, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, the silver-haired woman from the plane. She stood at a distance, her own bag already in hand, watching Elena with an expression that was equal parts concern and admiration. The woman approached, her steps tentative but steady. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, her voice cutting through the hum of the terminal. Elena turned to face her, surprised but not displeased. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, "for standing your ground, for not letting them push you around." Elena offered a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I appreciate that," she said, "but it shouldn't have come to this." "No," the woman agreed. "It shouldn't have." She hesitated, as though weighing her next words. "I've seen this kind of thing happen before. Too many times. But most people don't fight back." Elena nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "Because it's exhausting," she said, "because you learn, after a while, that fighting back costs more than staying quiet. And sometimes, you just don't have the strength to pay the price." The woman's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "But you did. Today," Elena said, "but there have been other days when I didn't. When I couldn't." She paused, her voice softening. "It's not bravery. You know. It's survival." The woman nodded, understanding flashing in her eyes. "I admire that," she said, "and I hope you know. You made more of an impact than you realize." Before Elena could respond, the woman reached out and placed a hand on her arm. A brief but deliberate gesture. "Take care of yourself," she said, "and don't stop." Elena watched her walk away, her steps purposeful, her back straight. For a moment, the weight in Elena's chest felt lighter, as though the woman's words had carved out a small pocket of air in the suffocating tension. But the moment passed quickly, and the weight returned, heavier than before. She made her way to the exit, her suitcase rolling smoothly behind her. Outside, the night air hit her like a wall, cool and crisp, but carrying the faint scent of exhaust and asphalt. The line for taxis stretched long, a serpentine trail of travelers waiting to be ferried to their destinations. Elena joined the line, her posture rigid, her mind racing. The confrontation on the plane, the tense waiting room, the captain's empty words, it all played back in her mind, each moment sharpening her anger. She thought about the countless times she had been forced to prove herself, to defend her place, to endure the quiet humiliations that were so easily dismissed by others as misunderstandings or mistakes. When her turn came, she stepped into the back seat of the taxi without a word. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" he asked. Elena gave him the address of her hotel. Her voice clipped. She leaned back against the seat as the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurring outside the window. The ride was quiet, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the occasional honk from a passing car. Elena closed her eyes, but rest didn't come. Instead, her thoughts churned, each one louder than the last. She thought about the way Claire's voice had risen in the cabin, how it had carried the weight of something unspoken. She thought about the captain's reluctance to take a stand, his hesitation a mirror of the indifference she had encountered her entire life. She thought about the other passengers, their silence a kind of complicity, their murmurs too little, too late. But most of all, she thought about the question that had haunted her for years, the question she had stopped asking because the answer never changed. How long will I have to prove that I belong? As the taxi pulled up to the hotel, Elena opened her eyes and exhaled slowly. She handed the driver a tip, her movements deliberate, and stepped out into the cool night air. The hotel loomed before her, its facade gleaming under the streetlights, a symbol of luxury and comfort that felt as foreign to her now as it had the first time she had walked through its doors. She stood there for a moment, her suitcase by her side, her mind heavy with the weight of the day. And then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked inside, because no matter how heavy the weight, no matter how many battles she had to fight, she would keep walking, she would keep standing, she would keep proving herself not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now, the hotel lobby was quiet, the soft strains of piano music filtering through the air like a lullaby for weary travelers. Elena Brooks stepped inside, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her suitcase gliding smoothly behind her. The concierge offered her a practiced smile as she approached the desk. But she could feel the flicker of hesitation, the subtle narrowing of the eyes that lasted just a moment too long. "Welcome back, Miss Brooks," the concierge said, his tone warm but distant. Elena nodded, handing over her ID. "Thank you." The check-in process was seamless, efficient. The concierge handed her the keycard with a bright, polite smile that felt more rehearsed than genuine. Elena took it without comment and made her way to the elevator, her mind already spinning with the events of the day. The ride to the 15th floor was silent, the mirrored walls reflecting her image back at her. She studied herself in the glass, the tailored suit, the composed expression, the tightly coiled strength beneath the surface. It was a face she knew well, one she had perfected over decades of navigating spaces that demanded she be exceptional just to be seen as adequate. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors slid open to reveal a long, carpeted hallway. Elena walked to her room, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting. She slid the keycard into the lock, the light blinking green, and stepped inside. The room was immaculate, crisp white linens, a sleek desk by the window, a bottle of water placed neatly on the nightstand. It was everything she had expected, but it felt empty, sterile. The weight of the day pressed down on her as she set her suitcase by the closet and sat on the edge of the bed. She closed her eyes, willing herself to relax, but her mind refused to settle. The confrontation on the plane replayed itself in vivid detail. Claire's sharp tone, the captain's hesitant authority, the murmurs of the passengers, some supportive, others complicit in their silence. And then there was the silver-haired woman, her quiet strength a flicker of light in an otherwise dark moment. Elena thought of the younger man who had spoken up, his voice shaking but determined. Their actions had mattered, they had made her feel less alone. But the anger lingered, a low simmer that refused to fade. It wasn't just about the plane, or the waiting room, or the countless microaggressions she had endured throughout her life. It was about the unrelenting weight of it all, the way the world demanded she prove herself over and over again, as though her worth was always up for debate. She stood abruptly, the tension in her chest too much to contain. Walking to the window, she looked out at the city below, the lights stretching endlessly into the night. The world out there was vast and indifferent, a reflection of the same indifference she had faced all her life. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, her heart sinking as she saw the name on the screen, HR Liaison. Airline HQ. She answered with a measured tone. "This is Elena Brooks. Miss Brooks, this is Linda Marks from the airline's corporate office." The voice on the other end said, brisk and professional, "I wanted to personally apologize for the experience you had on today's flight. We've been made aware of the situation and take these matters very seriously." Elena's grip on the phone tightened. She could hear the carefully crafted script in Linda's voice, each word chosen to deflect responsibility while maintaining the illusion of concern. "I see," Elena said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "And what, exactly, are you planning to do about it?" There was a pause, just long enough to betray Linda's discomfort. "We're conducting an internal review of the incident and will be providing additional training for our staff to ensure this doesn't happen again." "Training," Elena repeated, her tone flat. "And how, exactly, will that training address the underlying biases that led to this situation in the first place?" Another pause. "Miss Brooks, we understand your frustration." "No," Elena interrupted, her voice rising. You don't understand what it's like to be questioned, doubted, diminished in spaces you've earned the right to occupy. You don't understand what it's like to carry the weight of those unspoken questions every single day of your life." Linda's voice faltered. I'm sorry you feel that way." Elena laughed bitterly. "Of course you are. But this isn't about how I feel. It's about what your airline and your employees chose to do. And until you're ready to address that, don't waste my time with hollow apologies." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Linda spoke, her tone subdued. "I'll make sure your concerns are included in our review." "See that you do," Elena said sharply. Before hanging up, she set the phone down and returned to the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, the exhaustion that came from fighting battles she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. A memory from long ago. You have to keep going. Elena, even when it feels like the world is against you, you have to keep going. Because if you stop, they win. Elena closed her eyes, her grandmother's words grounding her. She took a deep breath and opened them again, looking out at the city with renewed determination. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The morning came too soon, dragging the weight of the previous day with it. Elena Brooks stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lapels of her black blazer. The reflection staring back at her was calm, composed a fortress, but behind the carefully curated image, she felt the tension coiled in her chest, the simmering frustration that hadn't dissipated overnight. She had an early meeting with the airline's executives, a hastily arranged attempt to address her concerns before she could take the story public. The invitation had come late in the evening, delivered via email with the thinly veiled urgency of people scrambling to contain a problem they hadn't anticipated. Elena had almost declined. Almost. But she knew better than to let them define the narrative. The meeting was held in a sleek conference room on the 20th floor of the airline's regional headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But the room itself felt sterile, designed more to intimidate than inspire. Elena arrived precisely on time, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she stepped inside. 3 men and 1 woman sat around the long glass table, their suits immaculate, their expressions carefully neutral. "Miss Brooks," one of the men said, standing to greet her. His handshake was firm, his smile polite but strained. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice." Elena nodded, her face betraying nothing. "I assume this means you've had time to review what happened." "We have," the woman said, gesturing for Elena to take a seat. "And we want to express our deepest apologies for your experience. It doesn't reflect our values as a company." Elena sat down, placing her hands neatly on the table. "What values would those be?" she asked, her tone cutting but controlled. The woman hesitated, glancing at the man to her left, a senior vice president. If Elena remembered correctly, he cleared his throat, his voice smooth and practiced. "We pride ourselves on creating an inclusive environment for all our passengers. This incident was an unfortunate misunderstanding, and we're committed to ensuring it doesn't happen again." "Misunderstanding," Elena repeated, her voice sharp. "Is that what you're calling it?" The vice president shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I understand how it may have felt." "No," Elena interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "You don't, and that's the problem." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on the polished table. "You've spent less than 24 hours thinking about this," Elena continued, her voice steady but rising with each sentence. "I've spent a lifetime navigating it. Being questioned, being doubted, being asked, implicitly or explicitly, to justify my presence in spaces I've earned the right to occupy." The woman across from her opened her mouth to respond, but Elena didn't give her the chance. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," she said, her tone like steel. "It was a choice made by your crew to single me out because of who they thought I was. Because when they looked at me, they didn't see a paying customer. They saw a problem that needed to be managed." The vice president's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "Do you know what that feels like?" Elena asked, her voice rising now, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "To be treated as an outsider. No matter how many doors you've walked through. No matter how many seats you've paid for. To see the doubt in their eyes before you've even spoken a word?" The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, one of the other men, a younger executive with a nervous energy, spoke up. "Miss Brooks, we're committed to learning from this. We've already scheduled additional training for our staff to address unconscious bias." "Training," Elena said, her voice dripping with disdain. "That's your solution? A workshop? A few hours in a conference room won't undo years of systemic bias. It won't fix the culture you've allowed to thrive. And it certainly won't erase the humiliation I experienced yesterday." The younger executive's face flushed, and he quickly looked down at his notes. Elena leaned back in her chair, her gaze sweeping over the group. "What you're offering me is damage control," she said, "a hollow apology designed to protect your reputation, not to address the real problem." The vice president finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "What would you like us to do, Miss Brooks?" Elena met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I want you to stop pretending this was an isolated incident. I want you to acknowledge that this isn't about one flight attendant or one passenger. It's about a system that teaches people like her to see people like me as less deserving, less legitimate, less human." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. "And I want you to mean it," she added, her voice soft but fierce. "Because until you do, nothing will change." The room was silent again, the executives exchanging uneasy glances. Elena could see the discomfort etched on their faces, the way they struggled to reconcile her words with their carefully constructed narratives. After a long pause, the vice president nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice strained but sincere. "We have a lot of work to do." Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. As she stood to leave, the woman across from her spoke again. "Thank you for sharing your perspective, Miss Brooks. It couldn't have been easy." Elena turned to her, her expression unreadable. "It's never easy," she said, "but it's necessary." She walked out of the room without another word, her footsteps echoing down the quiet hallway. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that the war might one day be won. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city streets. Elena Brooks stepped out of the building, the glass doors closing behind her with a muted thud. The sterile air of the conference room still clung to her like a second skin, its weight heavy and suffocating. But the moment her heels touched the concrete of the sidewalk, a rush of clarity surged through her, sharp, invigorating, and unyielding. The meeting had ended, but the echoes of her words still reverberated in her mind. She thought of the strained faces around the table, the way their carefully rehearsed composure had cracked under the force of her truth. It hadn't been a victory, not yet, but it was a crack in the veneer, a fracture in the carefully maintained illusion of equity they had tried so hard to project. As she walked toward the curb, Elena flagged down a cab, her movements precise and deliberate. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor, didn't speak as she slid into the back seat. She gave him the address of her hotel, her voice steady, though the weight of the day pressed heavily against her chest. The ride was silent, save for the muted hum of the engine and the faint strains of a jazz station playing softly through the speakers. Elena stared out the window, watching the city blur past her. Each building, each street corner, felt like a reflection of the world she had confronted that day, shiny on the surface, but riddled with cracks just below. Her phone buzzed in her purse, pulling her attention away from the window. She hesitated before answering, her heart sinking slightly when she saw the name on the screen, Corporate PR Liaison. "This is Elena Brooks," she said, her tone clipped. "Miss Brooks, this is Janet Harris from the airline's public relations team." The voice on the other end began, overly polite but laced with a nervous energy. "I just wanted to follow up on today's meeting and ensure you're aware of how committed we are to addressing your concerns." Elena's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you?" she asked, her voice calm but razor sharp. "Yes, absolutely," Janet said quickly. "We understand the seriousness of the situation, and we're working diligently to implement changes that will prevent incidents like this from occurring in the future." Elena leaned back against the seat, her eyes narrowing. "And what exactly does that entail, Janet? A press release? A photo op? Another round of training that amounts to little more than performative apologies?" Janet faltered, her voice cracking slightly. I assure you, Miss Brooks, this isn't about appearances. We truly want to learn from this and improve." Elena let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Learn from it," she repeated. "You know, it's funny how often people say they want to learn, when the burden of teaching always falls on the ones who've already been wronged." The silence on the other end was deafening. "I'm not here to educate you, Janet," Elena continued, her voice rising. "I've done that my entire life. In boardrooms, in classrooms, in every space that looked at me and saw someone out of place. You want to improve? Then start by admitting that this isn't an isolated incident. Start by dismantling the systems that let it happen in the first place." Janet stammered out a weak response. Something about ongoing conversations and corporate responsibility. But Elena had already tuned her out. She ended the call with a curt goodbye, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The cab pulled up to the hotel, and Elena stepped out, the crisp air biting at her skin. She walked into the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The concierge greeted her with the same polite smile as before, but she barely noticed. her mind too preoccupied with the weight of the day. Once inside her room, Elena closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. The silence of the space enveloped her. But it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the unspoken questions she carried with her like a second shadow. She moved to the desk by the window, her eyes falling on her laptop. Sitting down, she opened it and stared at the blank document on the screen. For a moment, she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. And then, she began to type. The words came slowly at first, each one deliberate and weighted with meaning. But as she continued, they began to flow, her thoughts spilling onto the page like water breaking through a dam. She wrote about the plane, about the waiting room, about the boardroom filled with suits and empty promises. She wrote about Claire, about the captain, about the passengers who had chosen silence over solidarity. But she also wrote about the silver-haired woman, about the young man who had spoken up, about the small moments of resistance that had reminded her she wasn't alone. As the hours passed, the document grew longer, the words sharper. Elena wrote with a quiet fury, her fingers moving across the keyboard with purpose. She wasn't just recounting her experience, she was bearing witness. She was refusing to let the story be rewritten, to let it fade into the background like so many others. When she finally stopped, the city outside her window was cloaked in darkness, the lights twinkling like distant stars. She sat back in her chair, her chest heaving with the weight of her emotions. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But tonight, she had claimed something for herself. A voice, a truth, a refusal to be erased. And that, she decided, was a victory worth holding onto. The morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying with it the hum of a city already alive with movement. Elena Brooks stood by the hotel window, the sunlight cutting through the glass and casting long, fractured beams across the carpet. Below, the streets churned with cars and pedestrians, each moving with a purpose that seemed so far removed from her own. The laptop sat closed on the desk, but the words she had written the night before still lingered in her mind. They were raw, unpolished, but they were hers. She had poured herself into them, a quiet act of defiance against the erasure she had felt so keenly. But the weight of them, of what they meant and what they demanded, rested heavily on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Another call from Janet Harris, the airline's public relations liaison. Elena let it ring, her jaw tightening. There was nothing Janet could say that would change what had happened. Nothing that could undo the quiet violence of those moments on the plane. But it wasn't just about Janet. It wasn't just about Claire or the captain or even the airline itself. It was about the system they represented, the invisible threads that wove themselves into every corner of her life. It was about the countless moments, big and small, that had reminded her she was always an outsider, always a question mark in spaces that had never been built for her. The knock at the door was sudden, sharp, breaking the silence. Elena turned, her heartbeat quickening. She crossed the room, her heels sinking into the plush carpet, and opened the door. It was the silver-haired woman from the plane. "Miss Brooks," the woman said, her voice warm but resolute. "I hope I'm not intruding." Elena blinked, caught off guard. "Not at all," she said finally, stepping aside. "Please, come in." The woman entered, her movements deliberate, her gaze steady. She carried a quiet strength with her, the kind that felt unshakable, like a tree that had weathered countless storms. "I wasn't sure if I should reach out," the woman said, sitting on the edge of the chair by the window. "But after what happened yesterday, I couldn't just let it go." Elena nodded slowly, sitting across from her. "I appreciate that," she said, "more than you know." The woman smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You know," she began, her voice soft but unwavering. "I've lived a long time, seen a lot of things. But no matter how much the world changes, some things stay the same." Elena leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees. "And what do you do with that?" she asked. "How do you carry it?" The woman's gaze grew distant, her eyes clouded with memory. "You carry it because you have to," she said, "because if you don't, they win, and because there are people watching, even when you don't realize it." The words landed heavily, but they carried a strange kind of comfort. Elena thought of the young man on the plane, his voice shaking as he spoke up. She thought of Jessica, the flight attendant, her quiet apologies written in every hesitant gesture. And she thought of the countless others who had fought battles like hers, who had refused to be silenced. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something last night," she said, handing it to Elena. "It's not much, but I thought you should have it." Elena unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the neat, deliberate handwriting. It was a letter, brief but powerful, recounting what had happened on the flight and bearing witness to Elena's resolve. The final lines caught her breath. She didn't just sit in her seat. She stood her ground, and in doing so, she made space for the rest of us. Elena looked up, her chest tightening. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her expression gentle but firm. "Don't let them take this from you," she said. "Not now, not ever." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the words between them filling the room. When the woman finally stood to leave, Elena walked her to the door, watching as she disappeared down the hallway. As the door closed, Elena turned back to the desk. She opened her laptop and stared at the document she had written the night before. The words felt different now, heavier but more necessary than ever. She added the woman's letter to the file, her fingers moving across the keyboard with renewed purpose. She wasn't just writing for herself anymore. She was writing for the young man, for Jessica, for the silver-haired woman, for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a world that demanded they shrink themselves. And she was writing for the ones who couldn't write, for the ones who had been silenced before they could speak. The phone buzzed again, but Elena ignored it. The fight wasn't over, and the weight of it was still heavy. But she would carry it, because someone had to. Elena Brooks stepped into the conference hall, her heels striking the polished floor with quiet determination. The air was heavy with the hum of anticipation, a low buzz of voices murmuring beneath the chandeliers. Rows of chairs stretched before her, filling quickly with reporters, community advocates, and a scattering of onlookers drawn by the promise of confrontation. At the front of the room, a long table was set with microphones and nameplates. The airline's logo loomed on a screen behind it, a stark reminder of who controlled this space, of the institution she was up against. Elena walked toward her designated seat, feeling the weight of every gaze that followed her. She wore her confidence like armor, her tailored black suit fitting her as though it had been forged for battle. But inside, the tension churned, a tight coil of anger and resolve. To her left sat Janet Harris, the airline's PR liaison, her expression taut beneath a mask of forced composure. On her right, the senior vice president from the previous day, his face drawn in the universal language of damage control. They were here to listen, to offer the same carefully polished apologies they had rehearsed in boardrooms. But Elena had no intention of letting them control the narrative. The room quieted as the moderator stepped forward, her voice crisp as she welcomed everyone to the forum. This was billed as an opportunity for open dialogue. But Elena knew the script well. It was a performance, a spectacle designed to placate rather than confront. When the floor was finally turned over to her, she took a deep breath, steadying herself before leaning into the microphone. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice firm but measured. "I am here today not because I wanted to be, but because I had to be." Her eyes swept the room, locking briefly with those of a young woman in the second row who nodded in quiet solidarity. "What happened to me on that flight was not unique," Elena continued. "It was not an anomaly. Nor was it a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of a system that has been designed to question, to doubt, and to diminish people like me, people who have fought and earned their place but are still told they don't belong." The room was silent now, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Janet shifted uncomfortably beside her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Over the years, I have learned to recognize the look," Elena said, her voice rising, "the hesitation at the gate, the questioning of my credentials in boardrooms, the subtle narrowing of eyes in spaces that have been built to exclude. It is the look of someone who has decided that I do not fit their image of who should be here." She paused, letting the tension build. "But what I experienced on that plane was not just about me. It was about power, about who gets to wield it and who is expected to comply without question. It was about the unspoken rules that govern who is deemed worthy and who is seen as a threat." A murmur rippled through the audience, quiet but undeniable. Elena could feel the shift, the way her words were cutting through the carefully constructed defenses of those who had come here to observe, not engage. "And let me be clear," she continued, her voice sharp now. "This is not a call for more training modules or corporate workshops. This is a demand for accountability. For reckoning. For the kind of change that forces institutions to confront the biases they have embedded in their very foundations." The vice president leaned toward his microphone, his expression carefully controlled. "Miss Brooks," he began, his tone placating, "we understand your frustration, and we're committed to addressing the systemic issues you've highlighted. But these changes take time." "They've had time," Elena interjected, her voice slicing through his carefully chosen words. "Generations of it. And yet here we are. Still having the same conversations. Still fighting the same battles." The audience erupted into murmurs. Louder this time, a current of agreement and anger rippling through the room. Elena turned to the vice president, her gaze unwavering. "You want to talk about time? Let's talk about the time I've spent proving myself in spaces that demanded I work twice as hard to be seen as half as competent. Let's talk about the time I've lost explaining, justifying, defending my right to exist in rooms you've walked into without a second thought." The man faltered, his polished veneer cracking under the weight of her words. Elena turned back to the audience. "And to those of you watching, to those who have ever felt the sting of that same doubt, I say this: you are not alone. Your existence is not a question to be answered or a problem to be solved. It is a truth, undeniable and unshakable." The room erupted into applause, loud and forceful, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls. Elena stood her ground, letting the moment wash over her but not allowing herself to be swept away. When the noise subsided, she leaned into the microphone one last time. "This fight is far from over," she said, her voice steady, "but we will not stop. We will not shrink, and we will not be silenced." She stepped back from the table, her heart pounding as the applause swelled again. This time louder, fiercer. Janet Harris and the vice president exchanged tense glances, their polished masks slipping just enough to reveal the unease beneath. Elena turned and walked out of the room, her steps deliberate, her head held high. She didn't need to see the aftermath to know that something had shifted. Outside, the air was sharp and cool against her skin. She breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just passed. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to hope. The fight was not over. But today, she had taken a step forward. And that was enough to keep going.